Hello, my name is Anne Renee Reiser, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending this afternoon's program. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, assist in events like this, and plan an SAB-sponsored program every semester. Members of the SAB receive great opportunities to network with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you as well. If you enjoyed this afternoon's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Your attendance and feedback help shape future programming. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of today's presentation will be streaming online as well. Before we begin today, I'd like to remind you all to please turn off your cell phones. After the presentation, we will have time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will be coming around with a mic to assist you. Please just ask one brief question. Finally, if at any time during the program you have trouble hearing, ask me or another staff member, and we can assist you with hearing devices. And now please welcome a longtime friend of the Dole Institute, Dr. Jake Kipp.
It's a great pleasure to be here and a great honor to introduce our speaker. It's also a very good event, I think, because we've got some collaboration going on here between the Dole Institute, which is famous for its public affairs programming. Note the button here with Bob Dole just back this week. And the William Allen White School of Journalism, which is in fact co-sponsor of this event. And that is indeed altogether fitting and proper because our speaker today is indeed a journalist of considerable claim from her background. Vanessa Gezari is the James Madison Visiting Professor of First Amendment Issues of the Columbia School of Journalism. Before coming to Columbia, she taught narrative nonfiction and reporting and more reporting at the University of Michigan. I came to know Vanessa when she was working on a major book project, which is up there, the book we'll be talking about today, The Tender Soldier. I provided background interviews because the real topic here is what those of us who were involved in it called the human terrain system and the deployment of human terrain teams to both Iraq and Afghanistan. Vanessa is one of those journalists who got the bug to actually be with and spend a whole lot of time in other parts of the world. This recalls to me a generation of journalists that I remember from my childhood, mostly radio people, who were assigned to places very far away and who actually had some decent expertise about the place they were at, as opposed to being talking heads, which we get on another media I will not discuss. For the last decade, more than a decade now, she's been involved in what are the complications that arose out of 9/11, and she has been literally all over the world: Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, Kashmir, Sri Lanka, reporting for various newspapers about events in those places. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the New Republic, Mother Jones, Columbia Journalism Review, and other publications. I particularly wanted her brought here because her book, The Tender Soldier, tells truth to power. The way she chose to do it is, quite frankly, one of those things that makes every English professor very pleased. Because rather than what we would call is the social science survey of the phenomenon, she chose to build a narrative around a particular team, a particular soldier, in a particular place in Afghanistan. The soldier who lost her life serving in a humanitarian team was Paula Lloyd. And Vanessa puts that team, that soldier, and that problem in its context. And anyone who reads this book will understand the complexity of what we still face in Afghanistan and what we will always face when we are an intervening power in societies that we know very little about, have very little expertise on the ground, have insufficient language skills, and want to operate out of what I call the macro analytic context. That is, that it's the big war that matters. In fact, it's not big wars. It's micro wars. It's wars in particular place about particular things in particular contexts. And it is complex in the greatest degree. General David Petraeus had that insight when he wrote the Army's and Marine Corps' counterinsurgency manual. And human terrain was one way of trying to deal with what is a very complex and difficult problem. And Vanessa did a remarkable job in addressing that in a particular and compelling story. Vanessa?
Wow. Thank you very much, Jake. Right. So he could actually give this talk. And so now I'm trying to think, what am I going to say? Jake has kind of said it. So, but that was an amazing introduction. And I especially like the part about how an English professor would be happy, because my mother is an English professor, and she was my first reader when I was first starting to write. So I guess, I don't know, some of that may have worn off on me. Can everybody hear me okay? Probably better than okay. There's like a lot of mics up here. So thank you so much for coming out today. I gather you need the rain here in Kansas, but I'm sorry. I was looking at my phone trying to figure out what the weather would be like, and it was like 70, 80 degrees, it was saying. Is that true? Has that been the case here? Okay, so I didn't pack a jacket or anything, and then I got here and it was like 55 degrees. So anyway, I'm glad that you all came out. Thank you so much to the Dole Center, Bill Lacey for having me here. Thank you to the School of Journalism, and Allison, who's been shepherding me around everywhere and taking great care of me. Thank you so much. And especially to Jake, and also to Felix Moose, who collaborated to help bring me here with the Journalism School and the Dole Center. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, but I'm gonna mainly talk about what brought me to this story. And then I think maybe we'll go to Q&A. I'd like to leave a lot of time for that, because I think that you here probably have more interesting things to say than just listening to me rattle on. I'm going to show some pictures. And it's kind of wonderful to be doing this here in the Dole Center. I was here, I realized, once before as we were driving up in 2010 when I was deep into reporting the book, and I had, how many people in here are familiar with the human terrain system? Okay, Good, some of you. So I'll explain what it's a small, sort of originally experimental, no longer technically experimental anymore, program that the Army developed between sort of beginning in 2003, 2004, and began fielding in 2007. These are teams of civilian social scientists and others with social science backgrounds who have gone out into the field with soldiers and Marines in Iraq and Afghanistan to act as cultural translators. And that we can get into a lot more detail about what they do. But I remembered that I'd been here because one of their training sessions was actually held in one of these buildings, either this one or the next one over, I forget, when I came in 2010. And I just realized that driving up here and seeing this kind of amazing vista of the Dole Center. It's a remarkable building. So my story starts here, as it would for many people in my generation of journalists who went out to cover these wars. Most of us were Metro desk, city desk reporters before the wars. I found my way to Afghanistan in a sort of unusual circumstance. When this happened, I was on a plane. I flew out of New York on September 10th, the evening of September 10th, 2001, to fly to India to become a freelance foreign correspondent, which was this dream I had harbored. And I had worked as a city reporter. I had covered City Hall and cops and courts and education and all the things you cover when you're a young reporter, first in Toledo, Ohio, and then in Chicago at the Chicago Tribune. And I just sort of at a certain point said, this is boring, and I want to see the world. And to my mother's credit, she really encouraged me. My father thought it was a crazy idea. As soon as this happened, my mother really regretted that she had encouraged me to go fly off and try my luck in South Asia. But I got to South Asia at an interesting moment. So this is, I was in India there was a layover, and I was in India by September 15th, and the United States began its air war against the Taliban on October 7th. And on October 9th, I flew to Pakistan. So this is a picture I took in Islamabad in October, early October of 2001. And this is just to give you a sense of what was happening there. There were marches in the streets. There were burning effigies of George W. Bush. And this is kind of the perspective from which I saw from which I saw that event unfold. I'm from Connecticut. I have lots of friends and family in the New York area, but I was not there. And I was here. So I saw a very different kind of way of viewing what had happened. This is a picture of a nervous Pakistani policeman at the Khyber Pass, which is one of the passes into Afghanistan. This is one of the ways that I and others traveled into Afghanistan very early on in the war. I actually didn't go till 2002, but that whole fall of 2001 in Pakistan, we were all along this border trying to figure out who was going in, who was coming out, which people were Taliban, which people were civilians trying to escape the bombings. It was a surreal time. The Taliban was still holding a daily press conference at its embassy in Islamabad at 2 p.m. every day, which was like a news event unlike any other that I have ever seen or probably will see, in which the Taliban spokesman, whose name is currently escaping me, but he recently wrote a memoir called My Life in the Taliban, which is actually quite interesting. Anyway, he had an eye patch from his wounds during the Civil War, and then he was telling every day about the bombings and how many innocent people the Americans had killed. And then at some point he was picked up and went to Guantanamo for a while, and now he's out and living under the protection of the Afghan government. So just to give you a sense, as many of you know in this room, people change. One day you're up, you're down, so this is the way life is in Afghanistan. At that time, just a little quick primer on who was in charge where. These were some of our allies. These are various former militia leaders from a time that Jake and others here are well familiar with, when we were fighting the Russians in Afghanistan. So some of these folks, especially people like Dostum and General Atta, who are two warlords in the north who do not like each other and have big constituencies. and some of these others. Shirzai, actually a relatively new force in 2002 in the South. A little bit of a creation of the United States. In any case, these people were our allies, and these are the areas of the country that they controlled. And these are some of the folks who collaborated with the Special Forces and the CIA paramilitaries who were on the ground early in the war to help defeat the Taliban. So you can see the country is sort of divided up. And by the way, these people are all still around. Dostum is a leading vice presidential candidate now, and a lot of these folks have been actually enriched during this period, although many Afghans have a lot of concerns about crimes they committed during the Civil War, for which they have granted themselves amnesty. So we can talk more about that later, if you like. So just to give you a sense of what the country was like when I was first there in 2002, it was much easier to move around than it is now. I was in Afghanistan working as the main correspondent for the Chicago Tribune from 2002 until 2004, and I lived in Kabul for most of that time, and this is a Buzkashi game. Does anyone know what Buzkashi is? Probably some of you do. This is a game played in northern Afghanistan in which horsemen haul the carcass of a headless goat from one end of the field to the other, trying to get it into the other guy's goal area. So this is really amazing, a violent, fast game that is a really interesting spectacle of the North. These are the kinds of things we could go and see and write about. You can see the goat, the poor goat there. This is a story, just snapshots of what was going on at the time. This is a guy named Mr. Masudi, who's the director of the National Museum in Kabul. And these are some pre-Islamic Buddhist relics that they were taking out of storage that they had managed to save from the Taliban. The Taliban would destroy anything with a graven image on it, and they did destroy many of the statues in the museum, but these are some that had been stored and were now being taken out to be restored. This is a woman named Zara, who I wrote about, who was learning to drive. This was a big deal in Afghanistan. During the communist era, women had driven. You meet women who were bus drivers and things like that, but later in the Mujahideen era, when there was a civil war, and then during the Taliban, there was not that kind of freedom for women. And this is a woman named Hasina, who for a while in 2004, I trained Afghan journalists. And she was one of the journalists I worked with. She ended up starting an NGO. She was trained as a doctor. And I just took this picture because it was her getting ready for a holiday, putting on lipstick in the mirror. And I actually wrote about her, and I published this picture. And even though she lived in Mazar-e-Sharif and was from a very liberal family, this picture, when it went on the internet, really caused an uproar. And there was some talk about, were we going to take it down? And I ended up kind of being able to not take it down. But it was indicative of what was happening with women's rights and what's still happening, which is sort of one step forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and nobody really being sure where you stand at the end of the day and what the consequences are. This is a Taliban prisoner who I met in 2003. He's a Pakistani guy. He claimed that he was not a real fighter, but he had been on the front lines carrying bread and other things to the soldiers. And honestly, he didn't strike me as a fighter. He was pretty contrite, and he seemed like he really wanted to go home. And this guy was in a sort of legal limbo because he was not important enough or dangerous enough for the Americans to want to imprison him, but the Afghans didn't want to let him go because if they let him go back to Pakistan, they were worried he might come back. And so he was kind of a small potato in the scope of the Taliban. But it was interesting to meet one of these people, these fearsome Taliban who we heard about, and find that he was a guy who missed his family and felt that he'd been misled by the mullah in his mosque who told him that he should go fight for the jihad. These folks are some security detail that I was given against my will when traveling to the Pakistani border. And so these were our allies at the time, some of them. These are some Afghan police in a place called Barmal, which is near Shkin, which in 2003 was the most dangerous place for American soldiers. And I drove out there to go and see the border and see what was happening. There were a lot of Americans getting killed comparatively. So there had been something like maybe 3 or 4 Americans killed there over a period of several months. It was not a hot war, okay? And it still isn't, except in flashes. So those were big numbers. I went out there. We had also heard that the Americans had bombed a family compound out there and killed a bunch of civilians, and nobody had told that story. So I wanted to find this family. So these guys were my escorts. And this was the family who I ultimately found. So that guy's name is Moiz Khan, and those are his nieces with him. And he lost all 9 of his children in a single night to a misdirected American JDAM bomb, which is I think a 250-pound bomb. So this was the story that I ended up writing, and it was for the Chicago Tribune. What was interesting and sort of, it was a terrible story, but it was important because this had happened. This was beginning to happen. American bombs were beginning to kill civilians. There had been some of that during the initial invasion and the overthrow of the Taliban, but more and more, even as the country was, as most of the Taliban were heading toward Pakistan and into the mountains and kind of not in populated areas, there were civilians being killed in these attacks. And this became, as many of you know, just a huge issue for the Afghan government and for NATO and the Americans there. And ultimately, I think one of the biggest issues of the war for the West. So this was during this time when I was first in Afghanistan, between 2002 and 2004. I only spent 72 hours with the military. The rest of the time, I was able to be out on my own, getting in a car with a translator and a driver and going, to Kandahar, to the Pakistani border. We went to Herat, we went to Mazar-e Sharif. We went to all these little villages in between and really got to see how people lived. And that actually formed the basis for the book, which I'll get to. I couldn't have written the book, which involved a lot of time with military units, if I hadn't had that earlier time with the Afghans, because I wouldn't have known when you're with the military, you're in a bubble. So I wouldn't have been able to know what life was like in a village. And this is in my view, it's a huge problem for American soldiers in a place like this with a mission like the one they've had. So this was the one embed that I went on, the one military embed. These were infantry soldiers in a place called the Adigar Mountains in southern Afghanistan between Spin Boldak and the Pakistani border. And you can't see it in this picture, but there are caves inside these mountains that had been used by the Mujahideen fighters against the Russians, and now were being used by some militants who were with Hezb Islami, which is one of the factions in Afghanistan. So these guys were camped out here on the flat part, and then they were going up and doing cave searches during the day. So that was kind of what the military, these were small targeted missions. At that time, it was about capturing and killing Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters and leaders. It was not about sending girls to school. It was not about lots of other things that the war ultimately became about. This is a picture of the very first PRT. It's a provincial reconstruction team, and this might require some explanation. This was in Gardez, just south of Kabul in 2003. This was an idea that had, I think, by this time, it would be much expanded in Iraq. The provincial reconstruction teams are these sort of a circle of military force surrounding civilians. So there'd be a representative from the State Department, USAID, the US Department of Agriculture, and some other government agencies working within the security perimeter of a smallish unit. And the idea was that these areas needed development, but they were too dangerous for development workers to go working there on their own, like NGO workers or others, and only the military could do it. This was really an interesting example of civilian-military cooperation that we hadn't seen the like of this since Vietnam. It started slowly. People didn't really realize what it was. I think it's sort of not, it didn't ever really come to fruition in terms of what it might have been in Afghanistan, but it's the beginning of the kind of thinking that led to the human terrain system, this idea that we need civilians out in this place, but it's too dangerous for civilians to go alone. How are we going to bring civilian expertise to some of these places? And how can the military help? How can these two parts of our national infrastructure work together? So now I'm just going to fast forward. I left Afghanistan for a few years. I covered other parts of the world. I moved back to the United States. I took some of my things out of storage. I tried to live like a normal person in a house in Florida, and I worked for a newspaper there. In any case, things happened, and I didn't go back to Afghanistan until 2007. So it had been sort of, I guess, 3 years. And when I went back, I found that everything had changed for the worse. So things that had been going well in 2003, 2004 were no longer going well. Drug production was up. More of the profits from opium were going to support the insurgency. The insurgency had gained a lot of strength. So one of the key things that happened was that we started a war in Iraq in 2003, and most of our effort went there, and not much of it stayed in Afghanistan. That's kind of a very simple, blunt overview way to put it. Not a lot of complexity to that analysis, and it's one that probably everybody in this room has heard. It's only one part of the problem, but there's certainly a lot to suggest that we considered this war to be over long before it was over, and we know now that it's still going on. So I came back and I saw all of these things. There was more violence against NATO troops. Taliban were taking over small villages. And they hadn't done that in the past when I was there, and I was trying to figure out why. So I started spending a lot more time with soldiers. And why did I do that? Because it was clear to me that, and had been since I was first there, that whatever was true in the past, whatever had been true of the way America waged wars in the past, what was happening here was that the military was apparently, as far as I could gauge from being there, like, it was really the only element of national power that we had on the scene. So when I talk about these provincial reconstruction teams that had somebody from the State Department and USAID and these other government agencies, civilians in them, those were just miniature, tiny numbers compared to the number of soldiers who were there. And it was soldiers, and it was usually young soldiers, young infantrymen, occasionally women, but mostly men, 19, 20, 21 years old, who were on the ground talking to villagers, making deals, doing politics, and indeed kind of crafting our policy there in small ways, one village at a time. So even though if you talk to somebody in Washington or you talk to somebody at the embassy in Kabul, they would say, oh no, well, policy comes from here. When you were out with a platoon, you could see that they were making decisions about who was good, who was bad, who was reconcilable, who was irreconcilable among these insurgents. What did this guy really do? And with very little information. So when I first talked to those soldiers, I showed you that picture of the encampment under the mountains there. Those soldiers had not read, I remember being struck, this was very early in the war, they had not read a single book about Afghanistan. They didn't know anything about this place. They thought that everybody was a terrorist. So they would see an Afghan walking by the base, and they would train their machine gun on the Afghan because they were sure that this... Now, meanwhile, this guy was going to the brick factory, which is what he had been doing for many years and will continue doing for many years. So it was, as soldiers stayed on the ground, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, they learned. They learned a lot more. Now you have people who have done 3, 4, 5 deployments in these places. And it turns out, this was news to me, but that's the way the Army learns, is by going back and going back again. But early on in a conflict, at least in this conflict, there wasn't much of a sense of history or that this was a place where people actually lived and went about their business in a way very different from the way we live in some ways, and quite similar in others. And also that, these Afghans who they were seeing, they were actually, none of the hijackers were Afghans. So the idea that these guys were, we all know what role Afghanistan played in harboring bin Laden, but the idea that Afghan civilians were terrorists was quite a leap, given what we know about the history. So this is a picture taken from the window of a Humvee in Zabul province, which is in southern Afghanistan near the Pakistani border, very difficult. It's a place where the Taliban has a lot of indigenous strength. And I took this in 2008, and here's another one taken from the window of a Humvee. So I started taking these pictures and spending more time with soldiers because I wanted to begin to see Afghanistan the way soldiers were seeing it. which was not the way I had seen it. It was from a distance and from behind this very thick bulletproof glass. So what can we tell from these pictures? Well, I don't know. I mean, to me, the thing that was most apparent to me was that it's really hard to figure out anything much about these people from this distance. This guy could be a nefarious actor, or this guy could be going to get his lunch. It's sort of a really, really difficult thing to know. This is a group of children in Zabul kind of watching curiously when these soldiers stopped in the market. And this is a group of children in Helmand. And I really, I wanted to show this picture because in both of these pictures of children, you see kind of a mix of curiosity and real suspicion that I found interesting and very telling. So I think this guy on the right was like, what are you doing taking my picture? And so this was really interesting for me too, because traveling with the military, I also, and anyway in Afghanistan, I'm an outlier and a strange person. And when my arrival in a village is not something normal for Afghans. So that was always, that became part of my perception. Like I became very conscious of the fact that we were all outsiders there and that we were all kind of affecting and changing the way the country was operating just by our presence there. I started spending a lot of time in this place, which is a district called Maiwand in southern Afghanistan. Some of you who are history buffs may recognize that mountain. It's featured in a lot of Victorian paintings. This is this mountain and this plain was the scene of a major British defeat in the Second Afghan War. So this is an area that has a long history of resistance against colonial settlement. So I was there first in 2009, a few months after this team had been attacked. So this human terrain team, was the first human terrain team to go into southern Afghanistan in 2008. It was the third human terrain team to go to Afghanistan overall, and maybe the sixth or seventh, because there, in the total, because there were some that were sent to Iraq. So this is the team I mostly write about in the book. It's the team that Jake mentioned. The woman in the middle is Paula Lloyd. She was the team's social scientist, or one of them. There were another three people on this team who I'll talk about in a minute, who were there. They sort of operated as two separate units. But these are the three people who I mostly concentrate on in the book. Paula Lloyd, who was a Wellesley graduate, former soldier. She had been deployed to Afghanistan in 2002 on a civil affairs team. And she had then left the reserves and gone to graduate school and come back as a human terrain team member after many years in Afghanistan working for non-governmental organizations and development organizations. So she had kind of the perfect experience, I thought, for what you would want on a human terrain team. She had a background in anthropology. I could tell from what she had written as a student that she had really gotten it about what anthropology was for. And yet she also had a background as a soldier. So she was kind of perfectly made for this program that was meant to bring these two very, very different and not, pieces of the world that don't get along together. To her left, there, the guy, well, they both have sunglasses. The sort of, this guy right here, that's Don Ayala. He was a bodyguard for Hamid Karzai very early on in the war when Karzai had American bodyguards. And he had worked as a private security contractor also in Iraq, protecting American diplomats. Very interesting history. He was a former ranger, 45 years old, too old to get back into the army, but really wanted to get into the fight. And he, after doing all this private security work for 7 years, he saw this job advertised that you'll actually be able to learn languages. You'll actually be able to sit with these people and talk to these people, and you'll be able to affect change in these countries via understanding the culture and helping soldiers learn how better to understand the people they're fighting among. So Don Ayala joined this team. And then to the right is Clint Cooper, who is another former soldier, Pashto linguist, former interrogator, spent about 14 months as an interrogator, I believe with Lockheed Martin, working in Kandahar, talking mostly to Taliban suspects. So each of these people kind of covered a part of the war and had a unique and I thought really interesting and helpful potentially experience in these wars and all had been to Afghanistan before. I was to find this was really a rarity. Most of the human terrain teams I spent time with, the people on them had never been to Afghanistan before, and yet here they had been sent to be advisors and cultural translators to soldiers. So they had training, which I'll talk about a little bit, and which others here can talk about, because some people probably know more about it than I do. But these folks were really unique in the sense that they had long experience in the country. So what had happened? In 2008, these folks were in a market in Maiwand, in a little village, and a guy came up, they were talking to people about the local economy. Paula Lloyd was interviewing an Afghan about the price of fuel, and he, after talking to her for about half an hour in what seemed like a friendly conversation, he threw the fuel on her and lit her on fire. So that's where the book starts, and this was a horrific attack. She was grievously wounded. And I hesitate to say more than that for those of you who haven't read the book, because there is an element of murder mystery and thriller to this that I don't want to give away. But let's just say things got more complicated and more violent and more difficult after that for this team. And it started a chain of events that I found very interesting. I also found it interesting as a kind of allegory or parable of some of the larger issues going on in the war, which I can talk more about. When I was there in 2009, those folks had been taken out and they had been replaced by these people. On the right in the glasses is a guy named Carl Sleiku, who is a psychologist from Texas, who is a human terrain social scientist. He took Paula Lloyd's place on the team. The guy in the middle is a guy who went by the nickname Banger, former Marine, and he took Don Ayala's place on the team. And so I spent about a month and a half in Maiwand walking around trying to see what these people were doing. And I went twice with this team, 2 different times, several months apart. And this was in a wheat field where they were stopping to talk to the farmer to say, why are you growing wheat? Because most people in that area grow opium poppy. And the idea was, this was kind of interesting, wheat it's a fraction of the income that you can make from opium. So anybody who's growing wheat, they wanted to figure out why, because we want to kind of get rid of opium and have people plant more wheat, which is not a winning financial proposition for Afghan farmers. So here they were, they stopped to talk to these folks. And I just went around with them and saw what they were doing. This is a guy who we met in Zari, which is 1 district over from Maiwand, where there's a lot more shooting because of these berms, which are good for hiding behind. So it's much more openly violent. Maiwand has more buried roadside bombs. This area has more ambushes. And here's a guy who this team met out and about where they were trying to make friends and influence people, and they decided to share their Copenhagen chew with this Afghan, and he was very happy to take some, and so here he is enjoying it. And then this man came up, this mullah, and he wanted to share what he had with the Americans, which is this sort of this intoxicant that Afghans put here, like we do with tobacco. Some soldiers do with tobacco. And it has things like plaster, bits of plaster, and bits of, hashish. And so the Americans were not going to take that, especially not with me there taking pictures. So they kind of tried to, which is really awkward in Afghanistan. When somebody offers you something, it's like really bad manners not to take it. So anyway. This is them just on the same day talking with some of the local people, trying to figure out about the Taliban activity in the area. The man who they're talking to in the circle there is actually a Sufi, and the Sufis and the Taliban don't get along, and he gave them a blessing and told them a lot of bad things about what the Taliban had done to him, but he didn't have any real information about what the Taliban were doing now. But so this is kind of interesting, because this is one of the key things that these teams worked on. In my experience there were lots of things. They were asking questions about irrigation and about farming and about traditions and customs and how could the Americans be sensitive to those things while doing their operations. But they were also trying to figure out, like everybody was trying to figure out, who wants us dead here? And when the soldiers who would kind of walk into a village and say, who's the Taliban? Tell us where the Taliban are. The human training team would try to finesse it a little bit more. So they would first offer tobacco, and they would first have tea, and then they would say, well, so by the way, have you seen any of these guys around here? This is another human terrain team in Helmand, which I also write about in the book. These folks were with the Marines. It was a mostly female team, and one of the teams that was really problematic because these folks had never been to Afghanistan before, and actually had, with one exception, this person in this picture had no experience of the military and also no experience of Afghanistan. And there were many human terrain team folks who I met like that, not all. So some people have gotten after me, I'll just say, and it's a criticism that's come up about the book in that I concentrate mainly on two teams. The team that Paula Lloyd was on, which I take to be sort of the best case scenario for a human terrain team. And this team in Helmand that was at the point of the spear in the surge of Marines in 2009, I guess, when the Marines came into Helmand, 10,000 of them, and it was a really crucial moment in the war. And this was the team they sent out, and this team was not competent. So I focus on those two teams, and a lot of people have said, well, what about all the other teams? So I did spend time with a number of other teams, and what I found was that pretty much they fell into those two categories. It would break down the middle. 3 people on the team, if there were 6 people altogether, 3 people would be really good and really qualified, and 3 people you'd be like, where did they get these people? So that was kind of, and we could talk more about that. It was a key problem with the program, in my view, and it has to do with recruitment and training and lots of other things. And the difficulty of doing this kind of work, frankly. This is very, very hard work to do. So actually the Marines there in Helmand, who this team was attached to, in Nawa, they were doing some of the best counterinsurgency that I've seen anybody do. They were going into the markets every day, they were buying food, they were cooking over campfires, they were investing in the local economy, they were getting to know people, and people were starting to come talk to them, and really there was a real relationships building. They had actually, a lot of them had learned Pashto. They had a very savvy commander who also knew when it was good to have a journalist around, so that didn't hurt. So this story got written a lot. You may have read it in the Washington Post. I think my version came out before Rajiv's did, but that's all right. We won't linger on that. And this is actually the commander, Colonel Bill McCullough, on one of the holidays, one of the Eid holidays, dressed up in Afghan garb. So this is the kind of Lawrence of Arabia type of stuff that was happening with this particular unit of Marines, and they were very successful. However, there were all these other Marines who were here on Camp Leatherneck, which was the most unpleasant place I've ever been to in my life. It was literally, I could not believe the Marines are such gluttons for punishment that this is where they decided they were going to have a base. It was if you lived here on this base, you would think Afghanistan was hell. You would not have you would have no redeeming qualities for you. So you're on this base, complacency kills, so you got to be on watch all the time. And this is some bathroom graffiti in Leatherneck. So for those of you who can't see, fuck this godforsaken place. This is kind of the view of a lot of people on military bases in Afghanistan. I just put this slide in here because this is a recruitment poster that we as the United States invested money in, directed at I'm not sure who, since Afghans don't read English. And there's no number, and also they do this Rambo thing, this is very attractive to them, but this is not so good. That is a really rude gesture to point at somebody. So anyway, just one garden variety example of sort of culturally not really being in tune with what was going on. But yeah, so, and these were some representations of the Taliban that some of our psychological operations people came up with. This is in Host, actually, near the Pakistani border, and it essentially says, don't talk to these people, watch out for these guys are putting bombs in your road, which is kind of true, but again, a very cartoonish representation of the Taliban, potentially not that helpful, considering that we have to actually, wars end by talking. So we have to now actually deal with these people. And that's a bigger issue. Why didn't that sort of thinking come in earlier? Why does it take us so long to get to talking? This is the guy who was the main Taliban contact in that part of Helmand that I showed pictures of earlier. And he was a rather grandfatherly gentleman. But these guys were coming forward and saying, we want you to help us decommission our low-level fighters, which was way ahead of the curve. I mean, at this point, they were just beginning to talk about reintegration of some of these fighters. And so the Marines were having real success there. They had really, to use an old word, pacified that area. And this guy offered to take me to the Taliban so I could talk to them. But unfortunately, I was embedded with the Marines, so I could not leave and go talk to the Taliban, much as I would have been interested to do that. So just a few outcomes of this conflict, and it's been a couple years now since I was in Afghanistan, so there's an election going on, there are interesting things happening there all the time. I don't claim this is right up to the minute. So one of the things that you hear a lot about is girls going to school, which is true. There are many, many thousands of girls in school now. I show this picture because you can see these girls over here are hiding from the camera, okay? So they see that somebody's taking a picture. This girl I either didn't see or didn't care. And there's I'm not sure, I think the one in the sort of second foreground is just fixing her scarf. But, again, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. They're going to school, but, there are lots of problems still around that. And that also, importantly, wasn't something that we set out to accomplish. It was something that we can take credit for, and I think it's a good thing that's happened, but we went there to kill and capture terrorists. So this is a little different. This is a news meeting at Afghanistan's largest independent news agency. Journalism has really taken off in Afghanistan. There are tons and tons of Afghan journalists now and Afghan media companies. Some of them are owned and controlled by powerful militia leaders and political people, and few of them are more what we would consider to be impartial. But this is a big change. There wasn't any journalism at all under the Taliban, very little under the Mujahideen period. This is my photographer named Kathleen Flynn and me in Kandahar reporting for the book in burqas. Because in Kandahar, I still can't go anywhere without a burqa. It's just much easier for my translator there and my driver to have me in the car. I take it off when I'm inside somebody's house and doing an interview, but not for moving around. Because seeing a Westerner there is enough to cause a lot of trouble. And this, which is from a military sort of binder in Khost in eastern Afghanistan. This was like some soldiers who were stationed at the district center, and they had this book, like a Facebook, of different Afghans who would come to the district center, and what should they trust these guys or not. So I'm not sure how well you can see that, but it says, Dawood Jan, possible Taliban member or informant. Every time elders come to pick up dead Taliban bodies, he knows all of them. Doesn't like Americans. Okay, describes most Afghans. They know all the elders, and they don't like Americans very much. Or describes many Afghans. After he leaves the district center, we get mortared. Has family connections with the deputy governor of Khost and the deputy sub-governor. Watch very close. Don't put out any information around him. Not to be trust. Overall, very shady individual. Okay, so I put this up here because I wanted to write this book because I saw problems with the way our intelligence was working in Afghanistan and the kind of intelligence, the amount of nuance and texture we were gathering about people in that place. And this is like 10 years later, this was the intelligence rundown on Dawood Jan. Okay, overall very shady individual. So I want us to do a better job and know more about this guy rather than saying he's a shady individual who we really don't know much about. And the question is, how do we get there? How do we figure out who we should really be killing and who we should not be killing? Because these are really, really serious decisions that we're making in this country, if not for us, then certainly for the people who live there. And the human terrain system was one of the tools that was designed to help us with that. So I'm happy to take questions. There's not much in what I said that's specifically about the book, but that's by design because I wanted to tell you something that, if you want to read the book, it's out there. I hope some of you will. But I'm happy to take questions about any aspect of this, and thank you. Yeah.
When they were initially envisioned, did the human train systems, did they have that intelligence gathering concept? My understanding was it was, less of that. It was more on the cultural side, pointing back to the soldiers. But from your slides, I got the impression that these guys were out there collecting hard intelligence.
It depends what you, it depends what you think, like Bill Clinton said the definition of is. So it depends what you think the definition of intelligence is. And actually the definition of intelligence has changed since this thing was envisioned, the human train system. I make the argument that this was always conceived as an intelligence aid, but on the open source side, so certainly not on the classified side. These guys are not dealing with the same kind of intelligence that, for the most part, okay, it wasn't set up to deal with intelligence that is specifically about finding and killing enemies of the United States, for example, which is what teams at like JSOC and these kill capture teams that we hear about. This is a different thing. But the problem is that when you start picking up information in a place like Afghanistan, you start getting all kinds of information that when you analyze it becomes intelligence of various kinds. Some of it will be that what they call threat-centric intelligence that will have to do with kinetic or fighting operations, and some of it will be what they call white intelligence, which has to do with things like, well, what is the main tribe here, and what are the other tribes here, and how do these tribes get along? Those things can't be segregated out from each other. So I think, when I read the foundational documents, it depends when you think this program started, but when I read the foundational documents, including, there was an article in Military Review, which Jake had a byline on, describing what this program would be. Now, the program changed after that. It became different from what it was. But in that, I don't think, it's not confusing to me in that article what it was about. It was about a certain kind of cultural intelligence. When I talked to General Petraeus in 2010 in Kabul, and I said, is the information that these teams gather intelligence? He said, absolutely. So if you think intelligence is just about finding bad guys, then maybe you have some confusion. But if you think intelligence is about everything from the weather to the climate to the tribal mixes to who's talking to who to what kind of relationships there are between families, between tribes, and how that plays into the insurgency, then there's no question that that's what this program was all about. Yeah.
It seems to me that, I use a quote I just did last week in the New York Times, two fundamentally different ways of looking at modern war. One is that high technology solves everything, and civilians clutter it up. And if you could just hit the enemy with that very precise strike, everything would be absolutely hunky-dory. If you have a theory of complexity which says, no, those people are going to be there, and in fact, as General Petraeus would say, they are actually the center of gravity of the conflict. If they're not going to see you as a benign force that ultimately is a benefit to them, they're not going to tell you about red guys, and more importantly, they're not going to support you as green, if I can use the red, green, blue thing. And I think that's a fundamental point where we are, because there's a very seductive thing about technology. Technology offers silver bullets that solve problems until you get close to the micro-analysis of the problem. And then you have 5 dead Afghans who you can't explain, well, who were they? Why did they get killed?
Absolutely. One of the questions I often get asked at talks like this is about drones. So are drones a good idea? Are they going to solve all of our problems? Well, some people certainly think so, because it is the highest kind of elucidation or enunciation or embodiment of this idea that technology will save us from everything. The problem with a drone is that it can see some things, but it can't see everything. So, I've seen a lot of drone footage, because when you go to Afghanistan, It's playing inside the TOCs, the Tactical Operations Centers, all the time. They call it pred porn, predator porn. So you can look at people, I mean, like, it's like watching people, it's kind of hypnotic. It's like watching people go about their lives. You can see, because there are heat signatures when somebody's out sitting out smoking behind his house, and you can see when, people are walking and moving, and you can see children playing, you can see a lot of things. What you can't see is, you can't see faces, and you certainly can't see what's inside people's heads. You can't see what their intent is. So in this age in which we're piecing together various intelligence from various sources. So a lot of it is signals intelligence, and a lot of it has to do with tracking people's phones. But we know that in Pakistan, when you don't like somebody, you take a SIM card that you know is being tracked and throw it into that guy's garden and walk away. And then that's where the drone finds that. I mean, we know this because these things have been documented. And I don't take, the whole thing about how many civilians have been killed by drones, I don't know the answer to that because we don't have good documentation on that. We know that some have. We don't know how many because I've been up to those tribal areas in Pakistan, and I can tell you that nobody's getting in there. What we're getting is third hand, and I don't have a good read on how many people who are children or who were not insurgents have been killed, but I know that some of them have. And we have great documentation of some cases in Afghanistan, like something that's known as the Tahar killing, in which, for months, Special Operations Forces tracked a guy who they thought was a Taliban leader, and they killed him, and it turned out to be a completely different guy. And that was exhaustively reported by one of the best NGOs in Afghanistan, which is called Afghanistan Analyst Network. Everybody should look that up if you think that drones are foolproof. So there are real problems with this stuff. And my concern is that now that we've done this work, now that we built the human terrain system in the middle of these two wars, too fast, I think, and without enough care to some of the really important things that could make something like this work, that now we're going to be too interested in drones to keep paying attention to these problems and either develop the human terrain system into something better or create other similar kinds of things that can help us fight this kind of war next time.
When you started your talk, you mentioned the fact that the one gentleman had 9 children killed in a plane bombing strike. Then I think I heard you say that there was something of a shift, perhaps, to capture-kill teams that were physically going out. I take it 2 questions. Was there a definite drop-off in the number of planes and plane bombings that occurred because the results were so devastating? And then secondly, has that ramped back up with the drones? Did we see planes doing this damage early on, the shift to teams, and then now drones and teams, or just drones, or what did you see?
Yeah, not
what
really. I mean, so the preferable way for the Army to kill people is still from the air, and not just the Army, other elements of the military too, because no soldiers are going to get killed that way. So if you can kill somebody from the air without putting people on the ground in a dangerous situation, then you will try to do that if you're a commander. There have been times over the, 11, 12 years, 13 years that we've been in Afghanistan, 13 years. It's insane. So over that period of time, there have been periods when there were halts or slowdowns in the number of air attacks because it became so sensitive because so many civilians were killed. There have always been ground teams that have gone out from the very beginning. And I don't know how the numbers on those have changed. I know that at the height of the counterinsurgency era, the short counterinsurgency era, which began with McChrystal and continued through Petraeus, and even then was beginning to end because political will had very quickly run out on this idea that we were going to have a lot of troops and pay attention to population centers and stop focusing so much on targeted people. So during that time, I think there were probably fewer airstrikes and more of these teams, targeted special kill capture teams. But it's always been a mix, and we still do a lot of fighting from the air.
Have the drones taken the place to some degree of the planes and bombs?
Not as much in Afghanistan, but in Pakistan, because we're not able to actually send people, it would not be good for us to have people flying in planes there for political reasons, among other things, but yeah. There are drones in Afghanistan, though, watching.
Hey, Vanessa, great talk and great book. Also, I will plug it. I think it did a service both in describing something most Americans don't have deep any kind of contact with, and also providing a critique that we can use. So my question for you is, so what will good look like the next time? You probably more than any other person that I know of outside of government have done that third party look at this. So if you could be the architect of the human terrain teams of the future, or whatever needs to be in place of them, what would those be? What would they look like?
So that's a great question. Thank you, Tom. Thanks for your kind words about the book. There were many moments during the period when I was reporting this book when I was very glad that I was not running the human terrain system, that I did not have the responsibility for coming up with the right answer here, because it is not easy. I would be the last person to say that this is an easy fix. I would have to know more about the details of where the program stands now, but I would say that if I were doing it, I would take it apart completely and go back to the bottom of this idea and see, first of all, this program, there were some problems with the way it came into being. It was developed in part, it was developed by many people in many different parts of the national and sort of military infrastructure. But one of the people who became very prominent in the program was an anthropologist, trained as a cultural anthropologist, not really a cultural anthropologist, more of a war theorist, and sort of brought the whole idea of anthropology in a very kind of audacious and it's kind of reminded me of government-funded agitprop in some ways, way to this program. So it was very much, this is a very controversial, provocative person, Montgomery McFate, who really enjoyed putting her thumb in the eye of a lot of institutions, and primarily anthropologists. And so the way this program was constructed was, it was almost designed to send anthropologists completely up the wall. And that caused a lot of problems. And also the program wasn't really anthropology. Like, it wasn't really doing anthropology. So as people who are close to it know, that most of the social scientists who went out with these teams were not anthropologists. And many anthropologists object to the program for reasons that by their lights make a lot of sense. And I think they probably shouldn't, I don't think they should be directly involved in this program, except for the few who really want to step outside into practical anthropology and work with the military. But there shouldn't be I don't believe there should be a recruitment drive to get, like cultural anthropologists into working directly with the military. I think there are probably good reasons why they don't. So I think there have to be many fewer teams. It has to be built much more slowly and much more carefully. You have to be much better about selecting the people you send on something like this. They have to actually know what they're doing. They have to have lived in a war zone. They have to know the languages. They have to know something about the culture and how to analyze a culture. If they don't know about that culture, they have to have spent significant time on the ground somewhere in a culture that was not their own. And the people I saw, I would say about half of them had some of those skills and about half of them didn't. And when, you had people who, it was like they were really putting soldiers and Marines and Afghans in danger out there, because as one person on the team, I wasn't the worst critic of these teams. It was the people on the teams themselves who actually knew what they were doing, who said, those people can't tie their boots, and I'm on a team with that person, and this person is gonna get us all killed. So, I do appreciate, I want to speak truth to power, and I'm glad that Jake said that. That makes me very happy. As a journalist, you can't do better than that. It was one of the aims of this book. But when I went out to report, I asked for the best teams. I said, tell me your 5 best teams in Afghanistan. I want to spend time with them. And I didn't look for the bad teams. I looked for the good teams. And what I found was, some stuff that made me want to scream. So anyway, I think care, and in the middle of a war, care is not what is taken, and time is not what you have. So when the money's flowing, which is what happens in a war, you don't have the time to think. And you guys probably have been dealing with this a lot more than I have. And anybody who's in any institution, but particularly a huge bureaucracy like the Army.
I get to have a follow-up.
Yeah.
Because I declared that as a rule.
Yeah, good.
So the simple question then, do you believe that this sort of capability should continue? Because we talked.
We have to have people thinking about this stuff, yeah. Like, should there be a human terrain system? I don't know. We have to put some real intellectual muscle into this language and culture and understanding the world thing. We cannot, I do not want to be part of a country that is content to not understand the world. I don't want to do that. That is making it harder for me to go out in the world and be the citizen of the world I want to be and tell these stories. Because when you guys screw up, then they come after me too. Do you know what I mean? I mean, so we're all implicated in this. Now my passport is, I have to be careful. Yeah.
There's another part of this equation that may suggest a whole other set of solutions, which is the people who are receiving the information. So what I'm interested in, if you observed it during your embed, no, thank you. The commanders, the planners, the soldiers who were the recipients of either directly or indirectly the sociocultural work that these teams were doing, did it actually contribute to a better understanding of microdynamics within those units? Did they employ it?
Yes and no. Some did, and many have said, there was a great study, a very thorough study on the human terrain system that came out about the same time my book did, that National Defense University did, which if you haven't read it and you're interested in this, you should read it. It's the best thing by far that anybody within the military or connected to the military has done on the program. Their data showed that commanders said they really appreciated the teams. My experience showed that many commanders, the smart ones, were able to take something useful from the teams. But I had commanders who were saying, this team is great, it's the greatest thing. And that same guy, this was one particular brigade commander who, his team mutinied in the middle of the war because they didn't like their team leader, and the team leader had to be fired and brought back here to Kansas. And he had to call Steve Fondacaro, the program manager, on the phone and say, get me a different team leader because my team, it was like a meltdown was happening. The Taliban are out there, okay? We have really serious, national security and national interests at stake in this war. It blew my mind that people were having a meltdown over things that should have been ironed out in the States, like team dynamics, or that this team leader was a bit of a tyrant, which, okay, fair enough. But I don't know, the brigade commander still said he really got a lot out of this team. So, that's what commanders generally say, and I think they do get something out of it.
Hello, it's
Hi there.
kind of a follow-up to the gentleman over there. I was going to ask you the same. I know from my reading that the human terrain systems were really brought into or created to help the commanders, help the units that were engaged in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan to kind of understand, to help them understand the population that they were working in, and to kind of take another perspective versus, and it wasn't really a targeting perspective, it was really, hey, we're in a country and places that we don't know really what the people are thinking, we don't know how our operations are really affecting them, so the HTS came about. Mm-hmm. From your experience with the teams, have you been able to kind of see the dynamics between the teams that you were with and the units, providing that understanding, that information that helped them understand the environment a little better?
Yes, and I can give you, there are examples of that have to do specifically with helping the unit understand the dynamics of certain tribes. When I was in Host in eastern Afghanistan, where we are engaged in a pitched battle with the Haqqani network, which was, they're old friends of ours from before and now not so friendly with us. And so this has been a very hot area. It was also one of Osama bin Laden's favorite places to hang out for a long time. In that area, there is one tribe that is really powerful, and some members of that tribe are aligned with the Haqqanis. And so one thing that the Human Terrain, this is a John, they're called. One thing that the Human Terrain team that was quite good there tried to do was to get the commanders to understand that you had to work a wedge between the Zadran and the Haqqanis. You had to try to get, because you were never going to get that area on your side. Like it would look like it was coming over to, becoming more friendly and more peaceful for Americans, and then it would switch back. And so you were never gonna win the, I'm not sure either. You were never gonna win the day there without winning the Zadran over. So that was like something that the commander there, who was one of the most experienced officers I met in Afghanistan. He was on something like his 3rd or 4th deployment at the time in that area. He knew a little bit about that, but he wanted to know more, and he really understood why it was important. Like when the team pointed out, and they made some nice graphics showing the Zadran Arc and what was going to happen with these tribes, and how the Haqqani network was working with some members of them and trying to draw them away from the Americans. He got it about why that was important. So that's an example of where the message really did get through. There are other times when it didn't. And so I guess it's a really mixed picture. I mean, I wish that the book would be simpler and it could just say, this is a great idea, these teams were great, or these teams were all really bad. But I can't really say either of those things.
Do you have any last questions?
Thank you very much for being here. About 45 years ago, I was drafted into the U.S. Army. And I graduated from college. I just graduated from college. And in those days, we had 2S deferments. So you had 4 years, and if you finished your college by that time, then you could go, then you could be drafted. My degree was in business, marketing. And so we spent a lot of time studying the dynamics of consumerism, profiling consumption practices. And in the wisdom of the military, I was made a 91 G20. That was my military occupation skill. It was a social worker. And I'd worked a year at Midwest Research Institute before I went into the Army. I was on occupational deferment because of some work I was doing at the Institute at the time. My job in the Third Army was to interview Vietnam returnees who were seriously addicted to drugs, to opium and narcotics, and amputees. And I did that every day, four or five interviews per day, and I would document it. And every week we would meet with the psychiatrist and the psychologist, and we would work out how we would deal with the difficulties that these young men were facing. I recall at the time, now you do this every single day, you're writing the story of the individual, their view of the world, their view of that experience in Vietnam. And I wondered, outside of those intake meetings, anybody ever look at that information? Was that information ever mined? Was technology ever used to mine the information? Develop an understanding not only of the culture of the country, but the culture that that young person was going to experience after the experience. I also wondered, we learned so much in those intakes. And I wondered if the military had ever decided that they would take their 91 G20s, their social workers, and teach them about the cultures of the countries that they're going in, so that when we did those intakes, we would have a better appreciation for what that young man experienced. So that's question number one, do we do that today? Question number two, when I was in basic training, we were proselytized and taught certain forms of hatred, certain kinds of biases, so that when we would look at this population, we would see them in an untrue way. You with me? I'm wondering if we do that today in our training as well. Stereotyping, Sometimes I wonder if we haven't really learned over 45 years the depth of the experience of the people that were carrying the right military occupational skill. Does that make sense?
That's a lot of questions, but very interesting experience. And I don't know, I mean, some of that I can't answer. Like, I don't know whether those intakes were ever looked at and whether anybody ever analyzed that information. It's a fascinating question. I'd love to know. So within the human terrain system was set up to have these civilians who would help the Army, in particular, also turned out the Marines, to understand the people they were fighting among and against, okay? But there was also something else that people thought about that was quite important. It was not the main purpose of the program, but an important purpose, which was to sort of look back at the unit, to look at the military unit and try to analyze its culture, and in a way hold a mirror up for the unit of itself so that the Army would understand itself better. This is something that, this is a much less controversial pursuit for us to undertake, and even for anthropologists to undertake. Some anthropologists do work with the military, and I think some of them, I mean, the ones I talked to, found that part of things quite interesting, like the idea that you would be embedded with a military unit to work on understanding how that military unit did or didn't understand its impact or itself and its own behavior. Do you see what I mean? So that is that's actually something that probably a lot more could be done. I mean, unsurprisingly, the Army is not the most introspective of organizations. So, that whole thing of looking at your unit and trying to figure out why do you interact with these people the way you do? What is it about your culture that promotes that? To your question about are people indoctrinated in the Army to have biases? Infantrymen are taught primarily to close with and destroy the enemy. So that is the main job of an infantry soldier, okay? And so they learn things like bounding, all right? Which is how do you get ahead how do you move in a combat situation? They learn how to conceal and cover and how to use their guns and things like that. They don't spend a lot of time thinking about, well, these are people too. And you can see how those are really contradictory kinds of guidance to give to an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old. It's much easier for the Army to say, there's the target, get the target, than to say, well, that guy also has a family. That guy also has concerns and things that he wants out of life. So I don't think they need to be indoctrinated. It's kind of in the job description. It's what we ask our young men and women to do for us.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. We'll have a reception with Ms. Gezari where she'll do the book signing afterwards, and the books will also be for sale. Can we give a warm round of applause?